Let the day fall behind you. Find your comfort and let your mind begin to slow. Let yourself drift toward the ancient idea that all things rest in quiet balance. When this helps you sleep, subscribe. I add a new one every single night. A bone stylus moves across a strip of bamboo in the dark before dawn, pressing down with a deliberate, unhurried weight. The room is a narrow archival chamber in a Zhou dynasty library, and the walls are hung with bundles of similar strips, tied and labeled, each one a record of something that was once spoken and has since been pressed into form. The sound the stylus makes is dry and small. Outside, wind passes through the courtyard in slow intervals, lifting and releasing as though the night itself is breathing. The line the copyist has just laid down is broken, a single horizontal stroke interrupted at its center, leaving a gap where a solid line would have been. This is not an error. The gap is the point. The absence in the middle is not a flaw in the writing, but the most important feature of it, the thing the line is trying to say. He sets the stylus down for a moment and looks at what he has made. One broken line, the beginning of a hexagram, the smallest possible unit in a system that, when fully extended, will account for 64 distinct configurations of change. But before the 64, before even the 8 trigrams from which the hexagrams are assembled, there is this, the distinction between broken and unbroken, between yielding and firm, between what opens and what holds. The I Ching has existed in some form for longer than most written traditions have existed at all. Its 64 hexagrams, each composed of 6 lines arranged in a vertical stack, each line either broken or solid, encode what its earliest commentators understood as the living logic of change itself. Not a record of events that had occurred, not a set of instructions for events yet to come, something closer to a grammar, the deep structural vocabulary through which every situation, every relationship, every shifting arrangement of forces in the human and natural world could be read, named, and placed within its larger movement. What the broken line carries is yin. What the solid line carries is yang. These are the two terms, and everything else in the system is built from their arrangement. Broken and unbroken, receptive and initiating, cooling and warming, gathering and dispersing, these are not opposites in the sense of enemies or contradictions. They are the two necessary poles of a single field, and the field requires both with equal need. The copyist picks the stylus up again. He does not think of himself as doing philosophy. He thinks of himself as copying, but the act of copying this text in this room, in the small hours before light returns, is itself a small enactment of what the text contains, the careful, patient, unforced movement of a human hand through a darkness that will, without being compelled, give way to morning. Somewhere in the centuries after the I Ching's earliest layers were composed and gathered, a thinker sat down with a brush and began to draw circles. His name was Zhou Dunyi, and he lived and worked in the Song dynasty, at a writing table low enough that his brush arm rested close to the surface, and he drew with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that a diagram is an argument made visible. What he was drawing would come to be called the Taijitu, though the diagram itself predated his commentary on it, and the commentary would outlast almost everything else he wrote. The outermost circle is empty. That is the first thing. Before any shape appears inside it, the circle simply is, unbounded, containing nothing, and therefore containing everything prior to any distinction between one thing and another. This circle, the outer ring of the diagram, corresponds to a concept that the tradition would call wuji, the limitless, The undifferentiated, the condition before any line has been drawn between this and that. Zhou Dengyi pauses between strokes, not because he is uncertain, because each stroke is a philosophical act, and he understands that the pause is part of the diagram, just as the brush mark is. The circle that encloses everything must precede the shapes within it. Wuji must come before Taiji. The ground that carries no distinctions must be understood as the ground, or the distinctions that arise from it will seem to be all that exists. Below the outer circle, he draws another. This one is not empty. Inside it, two shapes begin to press against one another, each curved along its length, in the shape of a wave or a comma, one dark and one light. The dark one carries yin, the light one carries yang. They do not sit side by side in straight halves, as two nations divided by a line. They curve into one another, each one's widest body beside the other's narrowest point, so that the eye moves around the circle continuously, following the edge between them, and never finds a corner, never finds a place where one simply stops and the other simply begins. Each half carries within itself a small circle of the opposite color. At the fullest swell of the dark, a white eye. At the fullest swell of the light, a dark one. This is not decoration. This is the diagram's most precise philosophical claim. At the height of its expression, each force already contains the seed of what it will become. The warmest noon carries within it the first cool turning toward evening. The deepest cold of winter holds at its center the first pulse of returning warmth. Joduni understood the Taijitu not as a symbol in the casual sense, something that stands in for an idea, but as a direct description. The supreme ultimate, what the tradition called Taiji, generates yang through movement and yin through stillness, not through a decision, not through intention, through the nature of what it is, which is the capacity to turn. Movement and stillness alternate, and from their alternation, the 10,000 things of the manifest world arise, each one a particular and temporary configuration of yin and yang, each one real and complete in itself, each one also a moment in a turning that was never interrupted and will not be interrupted. The diagram he drew, once finished, was circular and bounded, not a line running from left to right, not an arrow, not a progression from lower to higher, a circle. The return is already in the departure. The going out is already in the coming back. The shape of the argument is the argument. Before Taiji, there is Wuji, and the relationship between them is one of the most careful moves in the entire Chinese cosmological tradition. Wuji does not mean nothing. It does not mean chaos or the void in the sense of a dark vacancy. It means the limitless, the state before differentiation has occurred, before there is a here and a there, a this and a that, a first and a second. It is not the emptiness of a room after the furniture has been removed. It is the openness of a field that has not yet been divided by any fence or path. A ceramic vessel sits in a courtyard at dusk, half filled with still water. The surface of the water reflects the last pale strip of sky above the roofline, blue shading toward gray, not quite dark, not quite day. If someone asked what is present in this vessel, the answer might be water, and the shape of the vessel, and the boundary between them. But at dusk, in this particular light, what is equally present is the relationship between the water's surface and the air above it, the place where one ends and the other begins, or fails to end, or begins to be indistinguishable. Wuji and Taiji are both present in that meeting, the undifferentiated and the moment just before differentiation, the still and the first breath of the turning. The philosophical significance of Wuji is not merely that it precedes Taiji as morning precedes noon, it is that it underlies Taiji continuously. The undifferentiated ground does not disappear when distinctions arise. It persists beneath them, as the water persists beneath the image it reflects. Every configuration of yin and yang floats, so to speak, on the limitless that preceded and exceeds them both. This is what the outer circle of the Taijutsu encodes, not a boundary that separates the diagram from the world outside it, but the reminder that all differentiation rests in something that requires no differentiation to be complete. The I Ching's hexagrams, when the copyist has finished laying them down in sequence, form a catalog of 64 distinct moments of change. Each hexagram names a situation, not a fixed thing, but a dynamic configuration with its own quality, its own inner tension, its own natural direction of movement. The hexagrams do not describe a world of stable objects arranged in a stable order. They describe a world that is always moving, always shifting between configurations, always in the process of something becoming something else. What makes this possible? What makes 64 configurations sufficient to account for the full range of human and natural experience is not the number 64, but the binary grammar from which all 64 are built. Two kinds of line, broken and unbroken, yin and yang. Out of two, 6 positions. Out of 6 positions, 64 arrangements. Out of 64 arrangements, every situation that has ever arisen or will ever arise. The tradition's claim is not that all experience can be reduced to 2 abstract forces, not that the richness of a particular autumn morning or the specific sorrow of a particular parting disappears into a schematic diagram. The claim is that beneath the richness, beneath the specificity, there is a structural grammar, and that grammar is binary, the interplay of 2 forces that are not fighting but turning, not dividing but completing one another. Later commentators developed this binary grammar into something more articulated. The tradition of the 5 phases, what some texts call the 5 agents or the 5 transformations, mapped the movement of yin and yang through 5 distinct modes of expression: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, not elements in the sense of fundamental building blocks, not substances, but patterns of movement. Each phase names a quality of change. Wood names the upward, outward movement of growth. Fire names the peak of expansion, the full expression of yang. Earth names the pivot, the center, the moment of balance. Metal names the beginning of contraction, the first turning inward. Water names the depth of yin, the stillness from which the next cycle's wood will rise. An herbalist in an early apothecary sets dried plants along a shelf, moving from one end to the other with the unhurried focus of someone who has made this arrangement many times. Each plant sits in correspondence with a phase. The ones at the wood end are associated with the rising quality of spring, their energies upward and spreading. The fire plants carry warmth, expansion, the quality of high summer. The earth plants at the shelf's center have a steadying, harmonizing quality. The metal plants cool and consolidate. At the water end, the plants are deep and slow in their action, dark in color, associated with the body's most interior reserves. The herbalist does not think of this arrangement as decorative. She thinks of it as a small model of how things actually move. A shelf-length map of a process that occurs everywhere, in every cycle of the natural world, in the body's own seasonal rhythms, in the long breath of a life from rising to falling and rising again. The 5 phases are not 5 separate things. They are one movement in 5 positions. The way a wave is one movement as it rises, crests, rolls forward, breaks, and draws back. What distinguishes the five-phase system from simple observation of nature is its philosophical ambition. The phases were understood to generate one another in sequence. Wood feeds fire. Fire produces earth from its ash. Earth yields metal from its ore. Metal holds water in its vessels. Water nourishes wood. And they were also understood to check and limit one another. Water controls fire. Fire controls metal. Metal controls wood. Wood controls earth. Earth controls water. Two cycles, the generative and the restraining, woven together, ensuring that no single phase could dominate indefinitely without encountering resistance from another. This is the same principle encoded in the Taiji-Tu's small interior eyes. At the fullest expression of yang, yin is already present as seed. At the deepest yin, yang already stirs. The five phases extend this binary insight into a grammar of 5 moments, giving the tradition a finer instrument for reading the particular texture of a given situation, a given season, a given body's state. But the underlying logic remains the same. Transformation is structural, not accidental. Change follows a pattern. The pattern is not imposed from outside. It is the way the interplay of complementary forces moves when nothing interferes with their natural turning. The scholar in the archive does not hurry. He has many strips to copy, and the night is long. He lays down another line, this one solid, unbroken yang, and the hexagram grows by one. The broken and unbroken lines stack above one another with a patience that feels in this stillness almost like argument. Here, yielding. Here, firm. Here again, yielding. 3 lines, then 3 more, and a hexagram is complete. And somewhere in that stack of broken and unbroken, the ancient commentators read the quality of a specific kind of moment, whether to advance or withdraw, whether the situation calls for action or for still attendance. To read a hexagram is not to predict. This is a point the tradition makes with care. The I Ching does not tell what will happen, it describes what is. It describes the configuration of forces at a given moment, the particular arrangement of yin and yang lines that names the quality of the situation most accurately. From that description, a careful reader might understand which direction the movement is already tending, the way a navigator understands from the current that the boat will move as it moves, not because the current imposes a single destiny, but because the current is what the situation actually contains. The idea that all change is structural, that there is a grammar beneath events, a logic beneath experience, is an old one in the Chinese tradition. But the I Ching does not hold it as an abstraction. It holds it in the particular, in this line now broken, in this line now firm. The philosophy is in the stroke of the stylus, not above it. Zhou Danyi's diagram, complete on its surface, shows the Taiji-Tu whole and still, dark curving into light, light curving back into dark. The boundary between them, a line that has no sharpness, only the continuous elegance of a curve that belongs as much to one side as the other. The small dark eye in the light, the small light eye in the dark. The outer circle enclosing everything, touching everything at its inner edge, complete in itself with no seam and no gap. What the Taiji-Tu argues, and it is an argument, as much as any written sentence, is that opposites are not merely related, but constitutive of one another. This goes further than the claim that light and dark coexist. It says that neither can be defined except by the other, that each exists only because the other does, that the line between them is not a wall, but the place where they are most completely in contact. Dark is dark because light is what it is not, and light is light because dark is what it is not, and both of these definitions circle back into a single shape that contains them both without choosing between them. This is a circular argument in the best sense. The circle is not a logical flaw, it is the logical point. The relationship between yin and yang cannot be broken open into a line with one end at the start and another at the finish, because there is no start and no finish. The diagram that has no beginning and no end, no entrance and no exit, that closes back into itself, this diagram is the correct form for this argument. Any other form would be wrong. The Western zoo copyist presses another mark into the bamboo. Outside, the wind passes again through the courtyard, the same wind returning, or a different wind passing through the same gap. The question does not trouble him. The wind moves in the way wind moves, and the trees receive it in the way trees receive things, and the moment of their meeting is neither the wind's possession nor the trees but something that belongs to the meeting itself. There is a quality in the earliest layers of Chinese cosmological thought that is difficult to translate and easy to underestimate. It is not simply that the tradition noticed complementarity in nature, that hot and cold alternate, that day and night follow one another, that growth and decay are paired. Many traditions noticed this. What is particular here is the philosophical decision to place the interplay of opposites at the root of everything, not as a problem that reality must eventually resolve, not as a tension that a unified principle will eventually supersede, but as the basic fact about how a living cosmos works. The Taijitu, resting complete on its stone surface, makes this claim without raising its voice. Dark and light are here. They always have been. They are not failing to resolve into a single color. They are doing exactly what they do, turning into one another, each finding its complement at its own border, each carrying the other within itself at its fullest expression. The circle holds them both, neither privileging one over the other, offering no correction, suggesting no improvement. Wuji persists beneath this. The undifferentiated ground that underlies Taiji is not threatened by the distinctions that arise from it. It does not diminish when yin and yang emerge from it. It does not become something other than itself when the 10,000 things take form. It remains what it always was, limitless, unexhausted, prior to naming, carrying no preference between the broken and the unbroken, the dark and the light, the stilling and the moving. What the 5 phases add to this foundational picture is a sense of the path, the particular route that the turning of yin and yang follows through the manifest world. Wood, fire, earth, metal, water, 5 stations in a circuit that never stops. The herbalist who arranges her shelf according to these phases is not imposing an order on her plants. She is aligning her arrangement with the order that the plants themselves participate in, placing each one at the position in the circuit where its energies belong. The arrangement is an act of recognition, not of invention. This is part of what the tradition means when it describes the 5 phases as dynamic rather than static. They are not categories into which things are sorted. They are movements in which things participate. A dried root on a shelf is participating in the circuit of phases, whether or not anyone names it. The naming only makes the participation visible, the way the hexagram's lines make visible the quality of a situation that was already there before the lines were drawn. The Zhou dynasty archive, where the copyist works, is itself a kind of hexagram. The bamboo strips stacked and bundled on their shelves, each strip a record of a text, each text a record of an observation, each observation a moment in the long turning of human understanding. This room is the storage phase, the metal quality, preserving what the growth of wood and the expression of fire have produced. The copyist himself, bent over his work in the small hours, is the water beneath it all, still, patient, deep, holding in darkness what will rise again as morning approaches and the archives open and the scholars arrive to read. He finishes the hexagram he has been working on. He sets the completed strip to one side and reaches for a new one, smooth and pale in the lamplight. He positions the stylus. He presses down. The first line of the next hexagram is unbroken, firm, advancing, yang moving upward through its moment of expression. The archive is quiet except for the wind and the small dry sound of stylus on bamboo and the breath of the man making the marks. These three sounds together are the room's hexagram, if anyone were reading. Wind outside, work within, breath between them. 3 lines. 3 positions in the field between stillness and motion, between the world and its own understanding of itself. The Taijitu's circular boundary is not merely a frame, it is a philosophical statement about the nature of the interplay it encloses. The fact that it is circular and not linear, that it closes and does not terminate, that it has no before and no after, encodes the tradition's deepest claim, that yin and yang are not moving toward a destination. They are not building toward a resolution in which one overcomes the other, or in which both are absorbed into a higher unity that transcends them. They are cycling. The movement is the end and the beginning both. This distinction from linear models of opposition is easy to state and harder to genuinely hold. Much of what has been thought and written about the relationship between opposites assumes, often without saying so, that the opposition is a problem, that the tension between contraries is a condition to be overcome, resolved into a synthesis, or dissolved by a principle that includes both, or eliminated by the discovery that one of them is real and the other illusory. The Taijitu does not hold this. It shows 2 forces that are permanently in relation, permanently in motion with respect to one another, permanently real, permanently necessary to each other's existence. There is no third thing that will finally resolve them. The resolution is the motion itself, continuous, circular, complete at every moment of its turning. This is what the outer circle encodes, not the end of the process, not a wall that contains and confines it, but the form the process takes. The circle is the process. The boundary is what it looks like when something turns, and turns without stopping and without destination, gathering itself continuously back into the shape of its own ongoing. The scholar finishes his last strip for the night. The lamp has burned lower, and the light in the room has shifted to the warm, uncertain color of oil running thin. He rolls the finished strips into a bundle, ties them with a narrow cord, and sets them on the appropriate shelf. Outside, the wind has stilled. The courtyard is completely quiet. The pre-dawn stillness, the deepest yin of the daily cycle, has arrived at its fullest expression the moment before the yang of morning begins to stir. He does not leave. He sits for a moment with the lamp guttering beside him, looking at the shelf where the new bundle rests among the others. So many hexagrams, so many configurations of broken and unbroken, so many ways that 2 kinds of line can arrange themselves in a stack of 6 and produce something that names the quality of a moment in the long turning of a cosmos that was turning before the first line was pressed into the first strip of bamboo, and will go on turning long after the last lamp has been extinguished and the last archive has returned to earth. The Taijitu rests complete. It rests on a stone surface in a room that might be anywhere the tradition has been carried, a Song Dynasty scholar's study, a medicine hall in the Tang, a temple courtyard where the diagram has been cut into the stone itself by someone who understood that the stone was a good place for it, being patient and cool, and capable of holding what is placed in it without alteration, dark curving into light, light curving into dark, the small dark eye resting in the fullness of the light, already waiting, the small light eye resting in the depth of the dark, already present, the outer circle closing around both of them without seam, without gap, without preference between what it contains. Everything that can be distinguished has its place within this circle, broken and unbroken, the 64 hexagrams of change, the 5 phases of transformation moving through their generative and restraining paths, the supreme ultimate generating yang through movement and yin through stillness, the 10,000 things arising and returning, all of it is within the circle, and beneath all of it, beneath the circle itself, the limitless ground persists, undifferentiated, unexhausted, carrying everything that has ever emerged from it without having given any of itself away. There is no urgency in the Taijitu. There never has been. It does not argue. It does not insist. It simply shows the shape of how things move, when they move according to their own nature, without being forced in any direction other than the one they are already turning toward. Whatever appears to be opposed is here held together. Whatever appears to be in conflict is here shown to be in relationship. Whatever appears to end is here seen to be turning. The outer circle has no seam, no beginning, no ending, no point at which the line that forms it can be said to start or stop. The whole of it is equally boundary. The whole of it is equally enclosure. And beneath the boundary and the enclosure and the diagram and the stone it rests on and the room that holds the stone and the night that holds the room, beneath all of this, still and complete and requiring nothing added, there is always the ground that holds both. At the western gate of a mountain pass, as the last of the afternoon light crossed the threshold stones, a figure handed a gatekeeper a narrow scroll. The ink on it was still faintly damp. The gatekeeper, whose name was Yin Si, and who had asked for this writing before the traveler departed, held the scroll with both hands in the particular way that one holds something both light in weight and considerable in consequence. The traveler turned and walked on into the diminishing light, and what remained at the gate was the scroll, the cooling air, and the words that had just been set down. What he had written, according to the tradition that preserved his name, was 5,000 characters, not more. The text did not argue. It did not proceed by demonstration or refutation. It moved the way water moves, finding its path, not through force, but through a quality of attention, so precise it became its own kind of action. This was Lazi, or the figure tradition places in his position, at the moment of departure from the world he had watched long enough to understand. The text he left was the Tao Te Ching, and what it described in 81 short passages was not a system or a doctrine, but a way of seeing, a sustained attention to how things actually move when nothing imposes upon them, and how a life might be lived in alignment with that movement, rather than in opposition to it. The second chapter of that text sets down something that once read has a way of staying. It says that beauty and ugliness come into existence together, that being and non-being arise from each other, that difficult and easy complete each other, that long and short define each other by contrast, that high and low rest on one another, that before and after follow in sequence. These are not observations about language or about how humans happen to categorize the world. They are claims about the structure of reality itself, that no quality has existence except in relation to its complement, and that the interplay between opposites is not a problem with the world, but the very mechanism through which the world is real at all. This is the ground from which yin and yang grow in Taoist thought, not as metaphysical machinery, not as a diagram imposed on experience, but as the living texture of every moment in which two things arise together and hold each other in place. There is a carpenter's workshop somewhere in the older chapters of this tradition, empty now, the carpenter having finished for the evening and gone home. On the bench there rests a wheel he has made, or the hub of a wheel, more precisely. The spokes radiate outward from a hollow center. It is that hollow, the Tao Te Ching says, that makes the wheel what it is. Without the emptiness at the center, the spokes would have nowhere to meet, and what looked like a wheel would be only a collection of sticks. The hollow is not where the wheel is absent. The hollow is where the wheel is most essentially itself. Laozi returns to this image in different forms throughout the text. A clay vessel is shaped around emptiness. A room is made useful by what is not there. A doorway works because of the space between the frame. These are not metaphors offered for decorative purposes. They are pointing at something about the nature of yin, the receptive, the still, the dark, the inward, that his culture already understood as a philosophical category, but that he wanted to press deeper, toward the point where the word receptive loses its passive connotation and becomes something more like the necessary precondition of all that acts. Yang without yin has no ground from which to arise. Activity without stillness has nothing to move from or return to. Light that never yields to dark cannot be recognized as light. These are not consolations offered to those who find themselves in a quiet or diminished condition. They are structural observations. Yin is not waiting for yang to rescue it. Yin is the root from which yang grows, and to which it will return. The Tao itself, the source and ground behind the interplay of these two, resists every attempt to name it. Laozi begins the text by saying that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. This is not mystical evasion. It is a philosophical claim that any account of the Tao that fixes it as a concept, assigns it boundaries, or treats it as an object of knowledge, has already missed the point, because the Tao is precisely the ground prior to all fixing, all bounding, all the clean work of definition. It is what remains when every category has been laid aside, and it cannot be seen directly, only approached sideways, through attention to how things move. What it means to live in alignment with the Tao, to move with rather than against the grain of things, is what Laozi calls Wu Wei. The phrase is often translated as non-action, but this translation, taken alone, can mislead. It does not describe inactivity. It does not describe withdrawal from the world or the refusal to engage. It describes a quality of action that is not imposed from outside, but arises from within, the natural movement of things. The way water flowing downhill is not lazy, but is expressing, with perfect faithfulness, the nature of water and the shape of the slope it moves across. A river bends around a stone. It does not calculate the path of least resistance. It does not consider the stone as an obstacle and develop a strategy for overcoming it. It simply moves as water moves, and the bending happens as a consequence, entirely natural, entirely responsive, and in its responsiveness entirely effective. The stone is not moved, but neither does it stop the river. What results is not compromise but fit. Two things finding their correct relationship without either forcing the other. This is Wu Wei, made visible in water and rock, and the ethical life that Laozi is describing is shaped by the same principle. Not the suppression of action, but the purification of it, until what remains is action that does not strain against the grain of things, that rises from genuine attention to the moment rather than from the imposition of a predetermined shape. There is something in this that can seem deceptively simple, almost too plain to carry the philosophical weight assigned to it, but the simplicity is the point. The difficulty in living well, in the Taoist account, does not arise from the inadequacy of moral rules or the complexity of competing obligations. It arises from the persistent tendency of human beings to add, to supplement, correct, override, and improve upon what is already, in its natural state, in order. Wu Wei is not the first impulse. It is what remains when the impulse to impose has been allowed to subside. The word for individual virtue in Taoist thought is Taibri. It is the second word in the text's full title, the Tao Te Ching, and its meaning in this context is not moral performance or ethical achievement in the sense a Western tradition might recognize. Taib refers to something closer to ontological fullness, the quality of a thing being, without remainder, exactly what it is. The tabor of a tree is its treeness, fully realized. The tabor of a craftsman is the exact expression of her skill, undiluted by affectation or excess. The tet of a person is the living ratio of yin and yang that constitutes that person at that particular moment, expressed without distortion. This means that virtue, in the Taoist sense, is not something added to a person from outside through moral discipline. It is something uncovered, or more precisely, allowed, when what is false, forced, and imposed is gradually set aside. The person of great Ted does not strive toward goodness. Goodness moves through them as breath moves through an open passage without impediment. The relationship between effort and virtue inverts. The most virtuous action is the one that required no effort at all, because it arose from perfect alignment with the nature of the moment. Zhuangzi inherited this understanding and carried it further into places that were sometimes strange and sometimes funny and sometimes touched by a grief that was, in his hands, entirely at peace with itself. He was a thinker of the 4th century before the Common Era, a generation or more after Laozi, though the word thinker undersells him, because what he did was not so much think as observe, and observe in a way that his prose was barely enough to contain. He wrote stories. He wrote about a cook who butchered an ox with such precision that his blade never touched bone, sliding only through the natural spaces, the joints, the hollows, the places where nothing resists, so that the work was done without force, and the blade was as sharp at the end as at the beginning. He wrote about a great bird rising on the wind from the northern sea. He wrote about a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, and then woke uncertain, genuinely uncertain, whether he was a man who had dreamed himself a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming it was a man. And he wrote about the death of his wife. When she died, his friend Huzi came to find him, and found him sitting outside his door, not weeping, singing, beating time on a bowl and singing a song. Huzi was appalled. He said that Zhuangzi had lived with this woman, that she had raised their children, that she had grown old with him, and that not weeping was one thing, but singing was another thing, entirely. This, he said, was excessive. Zhuangzi did not argue. He said that when she first died, he had felt the same grief anyone would feel. He was not unmoved, but then he said he had gone further back before she was born, before she had a body, before she had even the form that became a body. Before her there was no form. Before the form there was no vital energy. Before the vital energy there was something undifferentiated and unnamed that was not nothing, but was not yet anything. Then, from that undifferentiated source, something changed. Vital energy gathered. A form coalesced. She was born. And now, he said, she had changed again. as the seasons change, as spring turns to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter, she had gone from one room into another, and for him to follow her with weeping would be to fail to understand the nature of the change, to act as though the spring had lost something when it became summer, as though the turning were a theft. This is not a performance of Stoicism. It is something more specific than that, and also more philosophically demanding. What Zhuangzi is describing is a genuine transformation in how the event is held, not a suppression of grief, but an expansion of the frame until the frame is large enough that what was appearing as loss appears, without forcing the appearance, as change. The grief does not vanish. The grief is real, and he says so, but it rests inside a larger understanding that the movement from form to formlessness and back again is not tragic but structural, the same movement that constitutes all living things, including the one who is grieving. He watched the clouds alter and dissolve against a gray sky. He understood her departure as another alteration in the same unending movement. And he sang. The Tao Te Ching's 15th chapter describes the ancient masters in physical terms, careful as someone crossing an icy river, alert as someone aware of danger on all sides, courteous as a guest, flowing as melting ice, whole as a carved log that has not yet been shaped into anything particular. These are not descriptions of men who have achieved serenity by conquering difficulty. They are descriptions of men who have become responsive enough to what is actually present that the question of conquering no longer arises. That responsiveness is the heart of Wu Wei in practice. It is not achieved through force of will or through any kind of accumulation. It is achieved, if that word applies at all, through a progressive lightening, through the setting aside of what is not genuinely the moment's own requirement. The Tao Te Ching says that in the pursuit of learning, every day something is gained. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day something is lost, until through non-action there is nothing that is not done. A calligrapher lifts her brush between two characters and holds the pause, not because she is uncertain, and not as a hesitation before proceeding. The pause is part of the composition. The white space between strokes is as compositionally essential as the ink. A character pressed against its neighbor with no breath between them is not more complete. It is crowded, dense, and harder to receive. The pause is not the absence of calligraphy. The pause is calligraphy continuing through a different mode, yin between yang strokes, each one making the other possible, the whole work emerging from their alternation. This is the Taoist account of balance, and it is worth sitting with long enough to feel how different it is from a more familiar understanding of that word. Balance, in a common usage, suggests equilibrium, two things of equal weight on either side of a fulcrum, neither moving, both canceling each other out. The Taoist understanding is not this. It is not stillness produced by the cancellation of two opposing forces. It is the dynamic alternation of two modes of the same living process, each making the other possible, neither complete without the other, neither more fundamental than the other. Yang acts, yin receives. Yang expands, yin gathers. Yang speaks, yin listens. Yang moves outward, yin moves inward. And then the turn comes, not as a rupture, but as a continuation, and what was yang becomes yin, and what was yin begins to open toward yang again. Not endlessly seesawing between extremes, but turning as a wheel turns, smoothly, because the center holds. Laozi's text gives this turning a practical application that never quite becomes a prescription. The sage, as he describes the exemplary person, does not compete, does not display, does not claim credit for what has been accomplished. acts without dwelling in the action, completes the work and then releases it. These are not rules. They are descriptions of what it looks like when someone has understood the movement of the Tao well enough that their life begins to rhyme with it. There is a quietness in this that can seem, from outside it, like passivity or disengagement, as though the Taoist account has advised the practitioner to withdraw and let things happen without participation. This is the most common misreading. What Wu Wei actually describes is the most complete participation, action so fully responsive to the actual character of the moment that nothing is wasted, nothing is imposed, and the effect is not diminished, but clarified. The master craftsman in the Zhuangzi tradition is not less skilled than the craftsman who forces the material. The master craftsman has found the natural grain of the material and follows it. The work is done more completely, more lastingly, and with less expenditure. The Tao Te Ching's 11th chapter, the chapter of the wheel and the vessel and the room, says that 30 spokes share the hub of a wheel, and it is in the empty center that the usefulness lies. Clay is shaped to make a vessel, and it is in the hollowness that the usefulness lies. Walls are cut to make doors and windows for a room, and it is in the spaces that the usefulness lies. What is there provides the form. What is not there provides the use. This is Yin's gift, rendered as clearly as Laozi ever renders anything. The emptiness is not a deficiency. The hollow is not where something should be, and is not. The hollow is the center of the function. Every vessel is a portable container of emptiness that happens also to have walls. Every wheel is a bearing of space that happens also to have spokes. To see only the walls, only the spokes, only the ink, only the yang, is to see only half of what is actually present, and perhaps not even the most essential half. An old Taoist practitioner sits in a garden at dusk without moving. He has been sitting long enough that the birds have stopped noticing him and have returned to their own business. The light is draining from the sky in the slow way it does in early autumn, the blue deepening without drama toward the gray that precedes dark. His stillness is not the stillness of a person who has fallen asleep or a person who is disconnected from the world around him. It is the stillness of a person who is very fully present to what is happening, the cooling of the air, the quality of the fading light, the sound of a small animal moving in the grass at the garden's edge, and who has learned, over the course of a long life, that this quality of presence requires no movement to sustain itself. What he is practicing, or more accurately, what he has stopped needing to practice and has simply become, is a kind of deep attunement. The Taoist literature gives names to these practices: Neiguan, inner observation, the quiet and unreactive witnessing of one's own internal states. But in his case, they are no longer practices so much as a way of being in a body and in a day. The practice has become indistinguishable from the practitioner. The wheel turns without effort. Zhuangzi has a passage toward the end of the inner chapters where he imagines a man who has learned to move through the world without leaving footprints, without stirring the water. This is not a description of physical technique. It is a description of the quality of presence of someone who has become so responsive, so fully aligned with the movement of things, that the disturbance one usually generates, simply by existing and wanting and insisting, has become very small. Not absent, Zhuangzi is too honest for that kind of claim, but small enough that the world closes behind the person the way water closes behind a hand drawn slowly through it. The teft of that person, their particular and irreplaceable ratio of yin and yang, their specific gravity and light, is so fully expressed in what they do and how they move that nothing is left over as performance or residue. They are, in the Taoist sense, real. Not in the sense that other people are not real, but in the sense that most people, most of the time, are carrying, alongside their actual presence, a great deal of additional material, the version of themselves they wish to present, the version they are afraid of revealing, the version they were yesterday and have not yet released, the version they intend to become by some future date. All of this is additional weight. The person of Tate has set most of it down. This is not a criticism of the people who have not yet set it down. It is a description of a direction of travel. Laozi's text is not prescriptive. It does not say that you must arrive. It says quietly and in a great many ways that the direction exists and that the movement in that direction has its own quality, and that quality, once felt, is recognizable. Zhuangzi, who was funnier than Laozi and sometimes wilder, gave this direction of travel a more dramatic name. He called the highest form of Taoist practice Zhuang, sitting and forgetting. It appears in the inner chapters in a dialogue where a student, at successive meetings with his teacher Confucius, reports having forgotten more and more. He has forgotten ritual, he has forgotten virtue, and finally, in the most complete statement, he says he has sat and forgotten everything, dropped his limbs, dismissed his hearing and sight, left the body, let go of knowledge, and become one with the great Pervader. This is Zhuang. It is not the forgetting of a mind grown vague. It is the progressive and voluntary release of all constructed categories, including the one that reads itself as a self, until what remains is not nothing, but an open and undivided awareness, the ground prior to all division, which the Taoist tradition names differently in different texts, but which always carries the quality of stillness that is also inexhaustibly full. The ground prior to division, the wheel before the spokes are attached, in a manner of speaking, the vessel before it is filled, which is to say, also the vessel as most purely itself. All of this turns gently toward rest. The Taoist texts are full of it, not as a final achievement or a reward for long practice, but as the ground condition that is always already present, and that practice, if it works at all, only reveals the clarity of still water, the usefulness of the empty room, the deepest part of the valley, which Laozi calls the spirit of the valley, and which never dies. What it means to be useful in this tradition has almost nothing to do with production or result. The usefulness of the hollow center is not a usefulness that can be weighed or measured or exchanged for something. It is the usefulness of allowing the spokes to meet, allowing the water to be held, allowing the light to enter through the window. It is the yin usefulness, the quiet and fundamental kind, without which all the yang activity in the world would have nowhere to land. A vessel sits half filled with water in a courtyard. As the evening comes in, the water's surface is perfectly still. The pale sky before dark is reflected in it with the precision of a mirror that does not try to mirror anything, that simply receives what is above it and gives it back without addition. The vessel holds both the water and the air above the water. The water holds the sky. None of this is arranged. None of this requires anyone to maintain it. It is happening, as everything in the Taoist account is always happening, without anyone being necessary to its continuation. This is what the text is pointing at when it says that the sage acts without acting, that the sage teaches without words, that the 10,000 things arise, and he does not begin them, that they grow, and he does not claim them, that he acts and does not dwell in the action, that the work is accomplished, and he does not rest in it. These are not paradoxes meant to dazzle. They are descriptions of a quality of relationship to action in which the self does not insert itself between the act and its natural arising. The act happens, the moment calls for it, the person moves, and then the person releases it. The way the surface of the water releases the reflection of the sky when the sky changes, completely, immediately, without residue. The word release is important here, not detachment in the sense of not caring, not indifference in the sense of not being present. The Taoist texts are careful about this. Zhuangzi cried when his wife died. He felt what he felt. He then understood what he understood, and the grief rested inside that understanding without being extinguished by it. Th, the virtue of being fully what one is, includes the full experience of what is actually present, not its management or suppression. What changes in the Taoist account is not the experience, but the relationship to the experience, the loosening of the grip that turns an experience into a fixture, a feeling into an identity, a passing condition into a permanent claim. The Tao does not hold on. The water does not insist on keeping the shape of the previous vessel. The season does not resist the next season. These are not failures of persistence. They are the full expression of a nature that has learned to move with the movement of things. In the 64th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, Laozi writes of a tree whose trunk is too large to encircle with one's arms. It grew from a seed smaller than a grain. A tower of 9 stories begins with a single handful of earth. A journey of 1,000 miles starts beneath one's feet. These are not motivational observations. They are pointing at the relationship between smallness and largeness, between the tiny seed of yang within the fullness of yin, between the first, almost invisible beginning of a turn and the vast turn that follows from it. Every great thing in the Taoist account begins in a condition so minimal it can barely be perceived. Every full expression of yang was once a small seed at the heart of yang. The principle is not that beginnings are important. The principle is that nothing leaps from nothing, that the greatest movements arise from the quietest origins, and that the origin is always yang. The evening practitioner in the garden has been still long enough now that the first stars are appearing. He is not watching for them particularly. They appear, as things appear when one is not insisting on what one is looking for, suddenly and without announcement, the way a thought arrives, not when pursued, but when the pursuing has been laid aside. He does not note their appearance with satisfaction. He simply continues being present to the cooling air and the deepening dark and the small sounds of the garden settling into night. The yin of the world is gathering. He is gathered with it. No distinction between his stillness and the stillness of the garden is possible from the outside, and very little is possible from within. This is not a mystical claim. This is the Taoist account of what happens when the tendency to impose, correct, supplement, and improve upon what is actually present has been allowed to rest, when the human layer of additional requirement has become thin enough that the person is present without agenda to what is simply here. The quality of that presence is yin. It receives rather than acts. It holds rather than reaches. It allows rather than commands. And in allowing, in holding, in receiving, it constitutes something without which all the acting and reaching and commanding in the world would have no ground to stand on. The empty vessel, the hollow hub, the white space between the characters, the stillness that precedes and follows every act and that gives the act its shape. These are not metaphors for something beyond themselves. They are the thing itself, inasmuch as the Tao Te Ching's deepest claim is that the shape of a clay bowl, and the shape of a life, and the shape of the cosmos are all expressions of the same structural principle, the interplay of yin and yang, arising from and returning to a ground that is neither and that is inexhaustible. By now, the courtyard is nearly dark. The vessel still sits where it was, the water still, and the reflection of the sky now showing only the very first stars and the deep blue that is almost not blue anymore, but not yet black. The surface holds the image of everything above it, without choosing to hold anything in particular. It is not a mirror that reflects selfhood back. It is a surface that allows what comes to rest in it for as long as it comes, and releases it as it changes, and is ready to receive what comes next, without having been diminished by what came before. This is the empty vessel, not a symbol of lack, not a thing waiting to be filled in order to become useful, the philosophical ground of all receiving, the yin that makes every yang possible, the stillness that makes every movement meaningful, the quiet into which everything that has been said slowly and naturally settles. The water holds the first stars. The courtyard is cool, and what the text has been pointing at all along, with its wheels and its water and its valleys and its seasons, rests in the simplest available form, here, in this still surface, at the end of the day, before the night has fully taken the sky, not empty at all, but present, open and ready. A Han Dynasty court physician unrolls a long silk manuscript in a room where morning light is just entering through a narrow window, the pale beam falling across the floor in a slow diagonal, not yet reaching the text. The manuscript is dense. Its surface holds diagrams of the body's inner landscape, rivers of qi traced in careful brushwork, organ systems named and positioned, the whole interior geography of a human life rendered as precisely as any map of the Yellow River and its tributaries. The physician finds the passage he is looking for. It begins as many such passages begin, not with the body, but with heaven and earth. This is where Chinese natural philosophy plants its deepest root. The body is not a machine to be repaired. It is not a collection of parts that may break independently and be fixed one at a time. It is a cosmos in miniature, a living system organized by the same principles that organize the turning of the seasons, the alternation of day and night, the slow cycling of rain into river, into sea, into cloud. To understand illness in this tradition is first to understand the structure of the world, the body and habits and mirrors. To understand health is to understand what it means for that mirroring to be accurate, the inner landscape held in proper correspondence with the outer one. The Huangdi Neijing, the inner classic attributed to the Yellow Emperor, is among the oldest sustained medical texts in the Chinese tradition. Its origins are obscure, and its composition extended over centuries, but what it delivers is a vision of the body as a philosophical statement. Health, in its framing, is not the absence of intrusion. It is not the body successfully defending itself against a world that means it harm. Health is the harmonious balance of yin and yang within the living system, the dynamic ongoing conversation between cooling and warming, consolidating and expanding, gathering and releasing, held in right proportion. Illness, when it comes, is not an enemy arriving from outside. It is a disruption in a relationship. Something that should be moving has slowed. Something that should be resting is agitated. A ratio has drifted. The treatment, therefore, is never simply the addition of what is missing or the removal of what has accumulated. It is the restoration of correspondence, the careful return of a conversation to balance. This distinction matters more than it may first appear. A tradition that locates illness in relational disharmony is doing something philosophically different from one that locates it in invasion or deficiency. It is saying that the body is always in relationship with itself, with the seasons, with the particular quality of the day and the year, and that this relationship is not incidental to health, but constitutive of it. The body cannot be understood in isolation. It is always embedded, always responsive, always part of a larger pattern of exchange. To treat it as though it were sealed from that pattern, as though its inner processes could be adjusted without regard for the quality of the air, the season of the year, the emotional life of the person who inhabits it, would be to misunderstand the very nature of what the body is. The medium through which yin and yang interact within the living body in this tradition is qi. The word resists easy translation, but the territory it names is not entirely foreign. Qi is the vital force that animates and moves. It is what distinguishes a living body from one that has become inert. It moves through the body along channels, the meridian system, as water moves through a river system, finding its path, circulating, nourishing each region it passes through. In its yang expression, qi is warming, expanding, rising, active. In its yin expression, it is cooling, consolidating, descending, held. Health depends on its unobstructed movement. When qi flows freely, when yin and yang are cycling through their natural alternation without impediment, the body maintains the dynamic equilibrium that the tradition calls health. When the flow is blocked, when one pole dominates without the other to complete it, the equilibrium begins to drift. A physician in the Han Dynasty, placing 3 fingers lightly on a patient's wrist at dawn, is listening for something specific. The pulse in this tradition is not simply a measure of the heart's mechanical function. It is a text. It has qualities, depth, rhythm, speed, strength, a particular kind of texture under the fingers that speak to the state of qi and to the balance of yin and yang throughout the body's inner system. The physician reads the pulse the way a practitioner of music reads a score, not listening for a single note, but for the relationship between forces, the way one quality modulates another, the pattern that emerges from all of them held together. 3 fingers, 3 positions on the wrist, and within each position, different depths correspond to different organ systems, different regions of the inner landscape. The physician listens, not for a problem, for a story, the story of how this particular body, in this particular season, in this particular stage of a particular life, is managing its fundamental conversation with itself. The organ systems of the body, in this philosophical and medical framework, are themselves organized along yin and yang lines. The solid organs, the zhang, are yin, the heart, lungs, liver, spleen, kidneys. They store, they consolidate. They hold the vital essences and fundamental substances of the body's inner economy. The hollow organs, the fu, are yang, the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, gallbladder, bladder. They transform, they receive, process, and transmit. They are the body's channels of conversion, taking what arrives from outside and making it available to the inner system. Each yin organ is paired with its yang complement, forming a functional unit: liver and gallbladder, heart and small intestine, lungs and large intestine, kidneys and bladder, spleen and stomach. The pairing is not merely anatomical, it is philosophical. No force in the cosmos operates in isolation from its relational field. The body knows this in its own structure. The kidneys hold a particularly significant position in this system. They are understood as the seat of the deepest yin, the fundamental restorative force, the storehouse of what the tradition calls jing, or vital essence, the most fundamental substance that underlies all bodily function. The kidneys govern water, they govern the bones, they govern what might be called the body's constitutional depth, its inherited vitality, the reserve from which all its activity is drawn. In the seasonal correspondence that Chinese natural philosophy maps with great care, the kidneys belong to winter. Winter is the paradigmatic yin season, the time of maximum inwardness, when the energy of the living world draws down into the root, conserving, resting, holding what was gathered through the yang phases of spring and summer and the transitional fall. A winter that is honored, truly rested through, not pushed against, replenishes the kidney yin and strengthens the foundation from which the next cycle of yang activity will rise. The lungs belong to autumn, and the correspondence between the lungs and autumn carries with it, in this tradition, an emotional and philosophical dimension that is not incidental but essential. Autumn is the season of letting go. The trees release their leaves without deliberation, without resistance, each one a small and particular letting go, the canopy thinning until the bare branches are visible, the structure beneath the surface revealed by the very act of release. The energy of autumn is the energy of the breath on its outward movement, the exhale that empties the lungs before they can fill again. The healthy grief of autumn. The tradition names grief as the emotion associated with the lungs, is not pathological. It is the natural, necessary, philosophically appropriate response to the movement of things toward their yin phase. It is the body's honest acknowledgement that the yang expansion is complete, that what opened must now close, that what rose must now descend. An autumn forest releasing its leaves in the gray afternoon light is a philosophical event. Each leaf has completed its yang work, the gathering of light, the exchange of gases, the slow photosynthetic labor of the growing season. Its release is not failure, it is completion. The tree draws its energy inward and downward through the yin transition, gathering into the root what will rise again in spring as new growth, new expansion, new yang. The forest floor deepens with the fallen color. The sky opens as the canopy thins. Below the ground, unseen, the roots continue their slow work. What appears as dying is the body of the year returning to its restorative ground. This is what the Chinese natural philosophical tradition means when it says the body corresponds to the seasons. It does not mean only that people tend to become ill in winter or feel energetic in spring, though those observations are part of the picture. It means something more structurally precise, that the body's yin and yang phases mirror the yin and yang phases of the year, and that the wise modulation of diet, activity, sleep, and emotional life in accordance with those seasonal rhythms is a form of philosophical alignment, a conscious participation in the pattern rather than a resistance to it. To eat warming, consolidating foods in winter and light, expansive foods in summer, to sleep longer in the dark months and rise with the longer light of the active season, to allow grief its autumn expression and not suppress it, because its suppression would block the lung qi and prevent the body from completing its own letting go. An apothecary in an early dispensary grinding 2 herbs together in a stone mortar understands the medicine not as a single agent targeting a single problem, but as a restoration of ratio. One herb is warming, it moves qi, it activates, it lifts what has sunk. The other is cooling, it consolidates, it quiets, it holds what has become too agitated. Together, they return a relationship to proportion. The prescription is not the addition of what is missing. Exactly. It is the nudge of a conversation back toward the balance it had temporarily lost. The physician who wrote it understands the patient's constitution, the season, the quality of the disharmony, not as separate variables to be factored in mechanically, but as aspects of a single relational picture, each one informing the meaning of all the others. The formula rests on shelves alongside dozens of others: dried roots, bark, seeds, flowers, some warming, some cooling, some that move, and some that consolidate, arranged not alphabetically and not by the diseases they address, but by their qualities, their nature, in the great schema of correspondences that organizes the tradition's understanding of the natural world. Wood, fire, earth, metal, water, spring, summer, late summer, autumn, winter, liver, heart, spleen, lungs, kidneys. The correspondences extend outward in every direction, linking the body's inner economy to the qualities of plants and minerals and seasons and flavors and emotions and directions and times of day. The whole constitutes something like a map of the principle that nothing is isolated, that every quality exists in relationship, and that health is the proper maintenance of those relationships as they shift through time. A diagram of the meridian system spread open on a wooden table beside a candle shows lines tracing the invisible rivers of qi through a rendered body. The lines have names, names of the organ systems they connect, and the functions they carry. They have directions, rising and descending along their designated paths. They have points along their lengths where the qi can be accessed and adjusted, places where the physician's needle or thumb can contact the inner river system from the outside, clearing obstructions, supplementing what is depleted, draining what is accumulated. The whole diagram, held at some distance in the flickering candlelight, has the quality of a landscape, the way a map of mountains and watersheds and river routes has the quality of a landscape, even when rendered on flat paper. The body, seen through this diagram, is a country. Its inner life is geographical. Its health is the health of a system of flows and exchanges in proper relationship with itself. This way of seeing the body has philosophical consequences that extend well beyond the clinical. If the body is always in relationship with its own inner systems, with the seasonal and daily yin-yang cycles, with the emotional life of the person who inhabits it, then the categories of inside and outside begin to blur. The emotion is not something that happens to the body, separate from its physiology. In this framework, the emotion and the organ are in a relationship of mutual influence. Grief affects the lungs. The lungs, when they are strong and their qi is flowing freely, support the healthy expression and release of grief rather than its suppression or collapse. Anger affects the liver. The liver, when its qi is stagnant, tends toward agitation and frustration. The relationship runs in both directions. Treat the organ and the emotion may shift. Attend to the emotional life and the organ system may begin to regulate. The body is not separable from the life of the person living in it, or is it separable from the life of the person in time? Chinese natural philosophy maps the daily cycle as a microcosm of the annual one. Each organ system has its hours, the 2-hour period in each day when its qi is most abundant and most active. The lungs' hours are the early morning, before dawn, when the breath is deepest and the day has not yet begun to press. The liver's hours are the small hours of the night, between midnight and first light, when the body is in its deepest rest and the liver is doing its quiet work of processing and renewal. The stomach's hours are the morning. The heart's hours are midday. The movement of qi through the meridian system follows the sun's arc through the sky, completing a full circuit in 24 hours, a daily turning as dependable and as philosophically significant as the yearly one. A body at rest in darkness, breath slow, limbs heavy, the chest rising and falling in the particular rhythm of deep sleep, is not simply unconscious biology. In the understanding of this tradition, it is a living system cycling through its most essential yin phase, the nightly return to the restorative ground from which the next day's yang activity will arise. Sleep is the body's daily winter. It is the time when the liver does its processing, when the kidneys consolidate their vital essence, when the yang energies that drove the day's activity draw inward and allow the yin to do its indispensable work. The yang is not absent during sleep. It is rather turning inward, retreating from the exterior where it manages the body's engagement with the world, and gathering in the interior, warming and nourishing the inner organs in the stillness that allows them to restore what was expended. To deprive the body of this nightly yin is not simply to lose rest. It is to prevent the completion of a cycle. The yang that cannot draw inward at night cannot fully emerge in the morning. The liver that cannot complete its processing hours accumulates what it was meant to release. The kidney yin that cannot consolidate cannot offer its reservoir to the next day's demands. The body, pushed through the night without the yin it requires, begins to operate on a kind of deficit, spending what has not yet been replenished, drawing on reserves that are not being renewed. In the language of the tradition, this is not merely fatigue, it is a form of relational disharmony extended over time. The yin phase denied its expression until the fundamental balance of the inner system begins to shift. This is why the Chinese medical tradition gives sleep a philosophical status that goes beyond its practical function. Sleep is not simply the absence of wakefulness. It is the necessary partner of the day, the yin to waking's yang, as indispensable as the night is to the cycle that makes the day meaningful. To honor sleep is to honor the full cycle, to allow the yin its expression, its hours of consolidating and restoring and drawing inward, is to participate consciously in the same intelligent alternation that governs all living systems, from the breath of the lungs to the turning of the seasons to the slow cooling and warming of the earth beneath its long sky. The pulse the Han physician reads at dawn carries all of this within it. 3 fingers on the wrist, and the whole inner landscape speaks, the depth of the kidney yin, the quality of the liver's movement, the rhythm of the heart, the breath of the lungs in their morning hour. The physician listens not for a verdict, but for a story that is always about relationship, always about the dynamic balance of complementary forces in this particular body, at this particular moment, in this particular season of this particular life. The story is never static. This is the tradition's deepest insistence. Balance, in the Chinese natural philosophical framework, is not a fixed state to be achieved and held. It is not a destination the body reaches and thereafter maintains without effort. It is a dynamic process, an ongoing movement through the phases of yin and yang, cooling and warming, gathering and releasing, descending and ascending, that by its very nature is always shifting, always responsive, always in the act of finding and refinding its equilibrium as the conditions around it change. A body in perfect health is not one that has stopped moving. It is one that moves freely through the full range of its yin and yang phases, without obstruction, without excess, without the domination of one pole at the expense of the other. The herbalist's 2 herbs ground together will not hold the balance permanently. The patient who takes them will return to the seasons, to the demands of life, to the alternations that are simply the nature of existing in time. The balance will need attending to again. The prescription may need to be adjusted as the season changes, as the life changes, as the body's own condition shifts in response to what it has received. The physician understands this as the nature of medicine in this tradition, not a cure, exactly, but a restoration of relationship that must itself be maintained in relationship with the ongoing changes of time and season and circumstance. An apothecary's shelves in the deep of winter hold different preparations than those of summer. The cooling, dispersing herbs that are called for in the heat of the yang season are set aside. The warming, consolidating preparations come forward, those that support the kidney yang, that help the body's interior remain warm and vital during the months when cold presses in from outside, and the yin of the season calls the body's resources inward. The physician who prescribes in winter understands that the season itself is a factor in the prescription, that the same disharmony presenting in summer and in winter may call for quite different treatments, because the relational context in which the body is embedded has itself shifted. This attentiveness to the season, to the quality of the moment in its larger cyclical context, is one of the things that gives Chinese natural philosophy its particular texture of care. It is a tradition that pays attention, not to the body in isolation, not to the symptom in isolation, not to the treatment as a fixed and universal response to a fixed and universal problem, but to the whole relational field in which the body lives and moves. The pulse at dawn in winter tells a different story than the pulse at noon in summer, even in the same body, and the physician trained in this tradition is equipped to hear both, to understand each within its proper context, without collapsing them into a single, seasonless account. A woman of late middle age rising early in autumn feels the particular quality of the season in her chest before she steps outside, a slight tightening in the lungs, a susceptibility to cold air, a quality of wistfulness that is not exactly sadness and not exactly longing, but something between them, in the register that Chinese natural philosophy names as the lung's appropriate emotional response to the turning of the year. She does not suppress it. She does not decide it is irrational and push through it. She allows it to move through her the way the breath moves through the lungs, in and out, the exchange complete, nothing held past its time. This is the tradition's wisdom made ordinary, made daily, made as unremarkable as breathing, the emotional life honored as part of the body's seasonal intelligence, the feeling given its movement as surely as the qi is given its movement along the meridian channels. The correspondence between the inner and the outer, between the body's yin and yang phases and the yin and yang of the world it inhabits, is not metaphor in this tradition, it is ontology. The body is genuinely organized by the same principles that organize the cosmos. The macrocosm and the microcosm are not similar by analogy. They are continuous. The intelligence that turns winter into spring operates through the same dynamic as the intelligence that turns a night of deep rest into a morning of replenished vitality. The same force that draws water from the ground into the cloud and returns it as rain is the force that lifts qi from the kidneys to the lungs and releases it with the breath. The scale differs. The principle is the same. This is why the Huangdi Neijing begins not with the body, but with heaven and earth. Before it can speak of the liver or the lung or the particular quality of a pulse felt at dawn, it must establish the cosmological ground within which the body makes sense. A body understood as a cosmos in miniature can only be understood by a practitioner who understands the cosmos, who knows the yin-yang principle, not as an abstraction, but as the living logic of the world, felt in the turning of the seasons, visible in the alternation of night and day, present in the quality of the morning air before the sun has fully risen. The physician who unrolled the silk manuscript at the opening of this long tradition of care was not simply learning a technique. He was learning a way of seeing, a way of placing every particular thing, every symptom, every pulse quality, every emotional tone, every dietary preference within the larger relational field that gives each particular its meaning. He was learning to read the body as the Western Zoe scholar read the hexagram, not as a fixed text with a fixed meaning, but as a living system of relationships that holds its meaning dynamically in the space between its elements, in the quality of their ongoing conversation. The candle beside the meridian diagram has burned lower since the physician began his evening study. The room has cooled slightly. Through the window, if there is one, the night is at its depth, the yin hour moving through its fullness. His own chi has followed its natural arc, the yang of the waking hours drawn inward, the body's orientation shifting from the outward engagement of the day toward the inward gathering that will restore it. He sets the manuscript aside, not because the study is finished, it is never exactly finished, but because the body has its intelligence, and the intelligence of the body in these hours is toward rest, toward the yin, toward the nightly return to the restorative ground from which all the day's engagement, all the reading and the prescribing and the listening to pulses and the grinding of herbs is drawn, and to which it must reliably return. The body in sleep is a philosophical statement. It is the claim, made in flesh rather than in words, that the yang cannot sustain itself indefinitely, that every expansion requires a corresponding gathering, that the very vitality of the waking life depends on the depth and quality of the yin that underlies it. The physician knows this not as a theoretical proposition, but as a lived experience. The quality of his attention in the morning clinic has a direct relationship to the quality of his rest in the dark hours. The sharpness of his listening at the pulse-taking hour reflects what happened while he slept. The silk manuscript lies rolled on the low table. The diagram of the meridian system, spread out beside it, shows its rivers of chi moving through the paper body's interior. In the room's stillness, there is something of the quality of the courtyard ceramic vessel filled halfway with still water, the surface reflecting the last of the lamp's light, holding sky and water in the same surface, the boundary between them not fixed but fluid, a threshold rather than a wall. The outer world has receded. The inner one continues its work. A body breathing in darkness, chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep sleep, holds within it all the correspondences the tradition has named. The kidney yin consolidating its reserves, the liver working quietly through its hours, the lungs soft and open in the dark, the heart's activity drawn low and inward, the whole inner landscape cycling through the yin phase that is not empty time, but the body's most essential philosophical act, its nightly participation in the same restorative intelligence that holds the roots of the winter forest alive beneath the snow, its brief, recurring return to the ground from which it rises each morning into the light. Heraclitus walked beside the river at dawn, not yet speaking to anyone, watching. A piece of bark had caught in an eddy near the bank, turning in a slow circle before the current pulled it free and carried it downstream. He did not move to follow it. The thought arrived not as something he had assembled, but as something the river was demonstrating, that the water flowing past his feet at this moment was not the water that had been here a moment ago, and that the river remained itself precisely because it was always changing, always replaced, always the same motion in a different body. He had been trying to say this for years, that the world is not a collection of stable things, but a single fire, a single tension, perpetually consuming itself and renewing itself in the same act, that what appears to be stillness is motion held briefly in a form, that what appears to be opposition is the signature of a deeper coherence, the way the string of a bow must be taut, must hold two directions at once in order to release the arrow in any direction at all. He stood at the river a while longer. Then he turned and walked back toward the city, carrying the thought the way one carries something fragile, not gripping it too hard. In a city at the edge of the Greek world, in a period when philosophy was still young enough to ask the oldest questions without inherited answers, Heraclitus of Ephesus built his entire account of reality on a single observation that opposites do not cancel each other. They constitute each other. The road that leads up the mountain and the road that leads down, he said, are one and the same road. What differs is only the direction of the walker. Hot and cold, wet and dry, sleeping and waking, living and dying. These are not separate conditions that alternate in the world like tenants in a house. They are a single dynamic seen from two positions. The word he reached for to describe the ordering principle behind this was logos, not yet the word it would become in later centuries. Weighted with theology and translation, here in his usage, it carried the sense of a proportion, a ratio, a measure that holds the tension of opposites in the relationship that makes them intelligible to one another. The river is not chaos. The fire does not simply consume. There is a structure to how things turn into their contraries, and that structure is not visible to anyone looking only at one side of the turn. What the Logos orders and what it holds is not peace between opposites, but the tension itself. And it is the tension, he argued, that keeps the world alive. A world without opposition would not be a peaceful world. It would be a world without motion, without heat, without anything becoming anything else. The opposites are not the problem. They are the engine. Not many of his written words survive. What remains arrives in fragments, in the reports of later writers, brief and sometimes cryptic. But the fragments that do remain carry an extraordinary compression, the sense of a mind that had pressed its thought down to the hardest, smallest form it could take. They have not stopped being read. The questions they raise have not been answered, only moved around, and in that movement, they remain as active as they were when he first set them down on the bank of the Caister, watching the current teach him what he already knew. Among those who inherited the Greek philosophical world without inheriting its answers was Anaximander, who had come before Heraclitus by nearly a generation and had stood before the same question from a slightly different angle. He was looking for an origin, not for the principle that holds opposites in tension, but for the source from which they emerge, and he could see, with the same clarity that would later mark Heraclitus's thought, that the opposites could not have come from each other. If cold came from heat, or heat from cold, one of them would eventually win, and the world would not be the endlessly alternating field it so plainly was. He called the source the Ipeiron, the boundless, the indefinite, a principle prior to all the specific qualities that opposites possess, prior to hot and cold, wet and dry, dense and rare, from which all these qualities differentiate themselves, and toward which they all in time return. The fragment that survives from his writing speaks of this return in terms that carry something almost like a moral weight. The things that emerge from the boundless must pay a penalty to one another for the injustice of their separation, in accordance with the ordinance of time. The language is striking and has been considered for a long time without being settled. What he seems to have seen, what his phrasing reaches toward, is that no opposite can hold its dominance indefinitely. Summer gives way to winter, not because someone has intervened, but because the cosmos itself imposes a limit on how far any quality may press before its complement begins its return. The apron is not destroyed by this alternation. It is the ground of it. Everything emerges, differentiates, runs toward its limit, yields, and flows back toward the undivided source. There is something in the shape of that idea that is very old and very wide, the boundless prior to differentiation, the cycle of opposition held within an encompassing ground, the insistence that no force can dominate without creating the conditions for its own reversal. These were the thoughts of a man in Ionia, scratching diagrams in a courtyard 2,500 years ago. They are also, in their deep structure, the thoughts of another tradition on another side of the world, which had been developing them in its own language, through its own images, for centuries before Anaximander sat down in his courtyard to draw his circle. The two traditions arrived at the same threshold from different directions and did not know the other was there. There is a Flemish cardinal who spent the middle years of the 15th century working in an Alpine diocese, writing in conditions of considerable isolation, trying to describe the nature of God with tools that he could see were inadequate for the task. Nicholas of Cusa had come to the problem through mathematics as much as through theology. He had been thinking about the infinite, about what it would mean for something to be genuinely without limit, and he had noticed something that no amount of ordinary reasoning could resolve, that an infinite circle, extended far enough, would become a straight line, that the largest possible thing and the smallest possible thing, taken to their absolute extremes, would coincide, that the maximum and the minimum, pushed to their absolute limits, were not opposites, but the same thing seen from two insufficient positions. He called this the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. He was writing about the divine nature, describing a God who was simultaneously the greatest and the least, the center and the circumference, the unity and the multiplicity, and he was doing so with the conviction that ordinary logic, the logic that says a thing cannot be both itself and its opposite, was simply too small to hold what he was trying to say. What was needed was not a different logic, but a willingness to hold the contradiction without resolving it, to stay inside the coincidence and let it stand. He wrote by firelight in a room in Brixen, night after night, trying to find words for something that resisted every word. The window was cold. The candle moved. He kept writing. What he was attempting, the description of a ground prior to differentiation, a unity in which all contraries are simultaneously present without canceling one another, carried a structure that would have been recognizable across the distance of centuries and continents to any careful reader of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao, as Laozi had described it, also refuses every adequate name. It also precedes the opposition of yin and yang, holding both within itself as potentialities rather than as actualities, neither dark nor light, neither full nor empty, but the source from which both darkness and light, fullness and emptiness, pour into the world without exhausting the source. The apophatic quality of both descriptions, the insistence that the ultimate ground can only be described by saying what it is not, belongs to both traditions with equal force. Nicholas of Cusa did not know about the Tao. The two traditions were separated by enough distance that no line of transmission connects them in this period. What connects them is something else, the experience of thinking carefully about the nature of limits, and arriving at the edge of what limits can describe, and finding there a coincidence that ordinary language has no room for. The mind that follows opposition far enough finds that the opposites have dissolved into something that contains them both. In the generation after Anaximander and Heraclitus, Greek philosophy turned decisively toward method, toward the systematic examination of concepts and the construction of arguments that could be followed and tested and disputed. But the intuition that had animated those early thinkers, the intuition that reality is constituted by the dynamic interplay of opposites, and that understanding requires holding both sides rather than choosing between them, did not disappear. It went underground, braided itself into the work of later thinkers, and surfaced again, centuries later, in a form that had changed its vocabulary and sharpened its tools without losing its essential shape. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a German philosopher of the early 19th century who built the most systematic account of opposition since Aristotle, and who did so by placing contradiction at the very heart of how reality moves. His method, which became known as the dialectic, describes thought and history and nature as driven forward by the tension between a position and its negation, a thesis and an antithesis, which press against each other until they are transformed into a higher synthesis that preserves something of both, while transcending the form of the original conflict. The structure is recognizable. Opposition is not an obstacle to understanding. It is the mechanism of development. What cannot be reconciled at one level of comprehension becomes the very force that drives thought to a higher level, where the apparent contradiction can be held in a new and more capacious form. The tension between opposites is not an error to be corrected. It is the engine, and yet the differences matter, and the mind that holds both traditions side by side feels them. Where the Chinese cosmological tradition describes the movement of yin and yang as cyclical, the dark giving way to light, the light returning to dark, the wheel turning without destination, Hegel's dialectic is linear in its aspiration. It moves forward. Earlier moments are preserved but surpassed. The synthesis is an advance, a development towards something more complete. There is a direction to the movement, and that direction has something like a goal. The Chinese tradition, by contrast, has no such destination. The Tai Chi Tu turns. It does not arrive anywhere. The turning itself is the point. This is not a small difference. It is the difference between a circle and an arrow. Both contain the insight that opposites belong together, but one carries that insight within a framework of progress, of spirit moving toward its own self-knowledge, while the other carries it within a framework of return, of a balance that has never been lost and never needs to be recovered, only recognized again in the next season, in the next breath. Hegel stands at one of the places where the European philosophical tradition came closest to the intuition carried in the Taiji-Tu, and the place where it also diverged most clearly. Both accounts deserve their full weight. Neither dissolves into the other. In a house on the shore of Lake Zurich, in the middle of the 20th century, a man sat at a writing desk that looked out over water. Carl Jung had spent decades in the company of the deepest layers of the human mind, not as an abstract proposition, but as a daily clinical reality, the unconscious of patients unfolding before him in dreams and symptoms and the unexpected insistences of an inner life that did not obey the official story the patient told about themselves. And he had noticed, again and again, a particular phenomenon that he eventually named with a word he had found in Heraclitus, enantiodromia. The word means, roughly, the running of things into their contraries. Heraclitus had used it to describe the cosmic tendency of any quality pressed to its extreme to reverse into its opposite, the hot becoming cold, the dry becoming wet, the dominant becoming the yielding. Jung used it to describe the same tendency in the psyche, a person who has lived entirely from one side of themselves, who has cultivated only the rational, the ordered, the socially acceptable, will eventually find that the other side asserts itself, often explosively, in forms the conscious mind did not choose and cannot easily control. The shadow, the anima or animus, the complex, all of these were names for the accumulation of psychic material that had been excluded from the official self. pressed down into the unconscious, and that accumulated there with a pressure proportional to the force of the exclusion. And when the pressure became sufficient, the material broke through. In dreams, in sudden reversals of behavior, in the kinds of private catastrophes that arrive without warning in well-ordered lives. Jung's response to this was not to recommend that the excluded material be suppressed more firmly. The response he developed, the process he called individuation, was something closer to integration, the progressive inclusion of the shadow and the contrasexual elements of the psyche, the gradual recognition that the self is not one thing but a dynamic field, that health is not the victory of one side over another, but the capacity to hold both in a relationship that allows them to function together without canceling each other. He had read the I Ching. He had written a preface to the first European edition of Richard Wilhelm's translation, in which he described his engagement with the text not as an academic exercise, but as a genuine inquiry into a form of knowing that operated differently from the causal logic his own scientific training had given him. The I Ching, he found, did not explain why things were connected. It simply attended to the connections as they presented themselves in a given moment. The way an experienced clinician attends to what is present in a consulting room before formulating any hypothesis about it. The hexagrams, those 64 configurations of broken and unbroken lines, each one a unique pattern of yin and yang forces in relation, functioned for him as images of psychic states, of the dynamic interplay of opposing forces within the self. He did not claim this made the I Ching a psychological text in any modern sense. He was careful about that, but he found it in its logic a family resemblance to what he had spent his career observing in the depths of individual minds, the same insistence that opposition is never simply opposition, that every configuration of forces carries within it the tendency toward transformation, that the extreme of one condition is always the beginning of its contrary. There is an image from 1947 that carries this convergence in a form that requires no argument. In that year, Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist whose work on the structure of the atom had shaped the emerging science of quantum mechanics as profoundly as any single mind of the period, was granted a Danish knighthood. The ceremony required him to submit a coat of arms. Bohr was a man who had spent years in the company of a paradox that ordinary logic could not resolve: the wave-particle duality of matter, the fact that a quantum object behaves as a wave or as a particle depending on how it is observed, and that both descriptions are necessary and neither is complete. He had come to think of this not as a problem with the theory, but as a feature of the deepest level of reality, that complementary descriptions, which appear to contradict each other, are sometimes both necessary, not because the logic is wrong, but because the thing being described exceeds what any single description can hold. He had named this principle complementarity, and it had become one of the governing concepts of quantum physics. For his coat of arms, Bohr chose the Taijitu. He placed the old Chinese symbol, dark giving way to light, light giving way to dark, each holding a small circle of the other at its fullest point, the whole enclosed in an unbroken boundary, at the center of a European ceremony of formal honors, and he placed beneath it the Latin phrase contraria sunt complementa. Opposites are complementa, the phrase he needed after a lifetime in the most advanced physics of the 20th century was the one that had been worked out in Chinese cosmological thought more than 2,000 years before he was born. He was not making a mystical claim. He was not suggesting that quantum mechanics and Taoist philosophy are the same thing, which they are not. He was recognizing, with the precision of a man who had thought carefully about both, that the shape of the problem he had encountered in physics, the shape of what it means for two incompatible descriptions to be simultaneously necessary, had a family resemblance to the shape of a very old intuition about the nature of reality. The taijutsu was not a decoration on his coat of arms. It was a philosophical statement. Opposites are not merely not opposed. They require each other. Neither is complete without the other. Any attempt to describe the whole with only one of them will always leave something essential out. The coat of arms was formally presented in a ceremony in Copenhagen. The circle was carried from ancient China into a European hall, and no one in the room who understood what Bohr was doing found it inappropriate. Some of them found it, apparently, exact. A philosopher sits at the edge of any tradition long enough, and the horizon begins to look familiar from the other side. This is not because the traditions have been secretly exchanging letters, or because one has influenced the other through channels that have since been forgotten. It is because the things that prompt philosophical thinking are the same everywhere. The experience of change, of opposition, of the way one thing becomes another, of the unsatisfying nature of answers that account for only half of what is present. The river Heraclitus watched runs everywhere. Every landscape has its bank, and its current, and its eddy where the bark turns in a slow circle before being released. Every mind that sits still long enough beside it eventually arrives at the same edge, that the river's identity is not in any particular water, but in the ongoing relationship of the two banks, that the opposites are not problems to be solved, but the very terms in which the world presents itself. What differs between traditions is not the fundamental observation, but the language given to it, the cosmological framework built around it, the specific images chosen to hold it in memory and pass it forward. The Logos and the Tao are not the same concept. The Iparon and Wuji point in similar directions without being identical. The dialectic and the cycle of yin and yang are both accounts of how opposites generate movement, and they arrive at different conclusions about whether that movement has a destination. These differences matter. They are not disagreements to be dissolved by discovering a common essence beneath them. They are genuine divergences in the way very careful minds have understood the same phenomenon, and the divergences are as philosophically interesting as the convergences. To flatten the differences in the name of universal harmony would be a kind of intellectual violence, the imposition of a false agreement on traditions that have earned their disagreements through centuries of careful thought. What the convergences show, held alongside the differences, is something more modest and more durable, that certain structures of thinking about opposition arise wherever thought stays with the problem long enough, that the intuition of complementarity, the sense that what appears to be in conflict is actually in a relationship more intimate and more constitutive than mere conflict can account for, has appeared independently in enough places to suggest that it is not a cultural artifact, but a recognition of something real. What that real thing is exactly remains open. Heraclitus did not settle it. Anaximander did not settle it. Laozi did not settle it, and did not think it could be settled in the way that settling a question usually means. Nicholas of Cusa settled it only in the sense that he found a name for the impossibility of settling it. Hegel built an entire system around the productive unsettledness of opposition and history's unfinished movement through it. Jung found in the unsettled quality of the psyche's opposites not a clinical problem, but the condition of all genuine development. None of them arrived at a point where the question closed. The question does not close, it opens. There is a particular quality to philosophical questions that have been carried for a long time by many different kinds of minds. They take on, After enough handling, the quality of a stone that has been worn smooth by a river. All the sharp edges are gone. What remains is something that fits comfortably in the hand, whose weight is familiar, and whose surface is warm in a way that new-cut stone is not. Holding it does not require effort. The effort was in the shaping, which is already done, which happened long before tonight. This question, the question of how opposites relate, whether they cancel each other or constitute each other, whether the principle that holds them is prior to them or emerges from them, whether the movement of contraries leads somewhere or simply continues, this question is worn smooth. It has been in many hands. The hands of a man watching a river at dawn in Ephesus, the hands of a scholar tracing a hexagram on a narrow strip of bamboo in the lamplight of a Zhou dynasty archive, the hands of a cardinal writing by firelight in an alpine room, trying to describe a god who was simultaneously everything and nothing, large and small, the center of all and the circumference of all. The hands of a physicist choosing an ancient symbol for his coat of arms in a ceremony in Copenhagen. All those hands, all that careful carrying, and the question still open, still smooth, still resting in the dark, exactly where it always has been. Bohr's coat of arms was presented on a winter afternoon. The ceremony was formal, unhurried, conducted with the careful attention that such occasions carry. When the moment came, and the design was displayed, the Taijitu at its center, the dark curving into the light curving back into the dark, the small eye of each at the fullest point of the other. There was, in the room, a quality of recognition that required no commentary. The oldest intuition about the nature of balance had crossed the world. It had arrived in the middle of a modern scientific civilization, carried by a man who had spent his life in the most mathematically rigorous tradition of inquiry that the 20th century had produced, and it had arrived not as an exotic borrowing, but as an exact match for what that rigorous inquiry had found at its own limit, the place where the wave and the particle cannot be made into a single picture, where two complete and incompatible descriptions are both necessary, where the description of the whole requires holding both sides without forcing the resolution that only one side can offer. Contraria sunt complementa. Opposites are complementary. The circle turns. The dark gives way to the light, and the light curves back toward the dark, and the boundary around them is unbroken, and the eye of each is present in the fullness of the other, and the whole requires nothing added to it, and nothing removed from it. This is what thought finds, across so many centuries and so many different languages, when it stays with the question of opposition long enough. Not a solution, but a shape. Not an answer, but a form that can hold all the answers in a relationship that does not require choosing between them. A circle, drawn in ink, or brushed in stone, or encoded in the positions of a physicist's formal seal, always the same circle, always complete, always already turning. The river that Heraclitus watched is still running. The bark that turned in the eddy has long since dissolved. The water that held it has reached the sea and risen and fallen and returned. What remains is the movement itself, the perpetual flowing of one condition into another, the cold running toward warmth, and the warmth running back toward cold, the whole balanced, not at any fixed point, but in the turning, in the ongoing, inexhaustible, self-completing arc of things becoming their contraries, and finding in the becoming not loss, but continuation. The men and women who first tried to say this clearly are long still. Their words persist, worn smooth, available to any hand that reaches for them in the dark. And the dark itself, the vast undivided quiet before any distinction is drawn, receives all of them equally, holds all of them with the same unhurried patience, requires nothing of any of them, and offers everything without condition. The circle on Bohr's coat of arms rests in its archives. The river in Ephesus runs without arriving. The thought continues, quiet and without urgency, exactly where it was, which is here and has always been here, needing nothing more than this, a mind grown quiet enough to recognize what it has always, in its deepest register, already known. A practitioner of Niguen sits in a room where the lamp has just been extinguished. The wick still holds a thread of orange that fades as the eye watches, and then the room is dark, and the darkness is complete. Outside, the night has been settled for some time. The practitioner does not reach to relight the flame. Attention turns inward, the way water turns when the outer current stills. Not forced, not summoned, simply arriving, the way breath arrives, without being called, without being owed anything, without requiring a decision to begin. The body is present, the room is present, the darkness holds both without distinguishing between them. There is a word in the Taoist tradition for what the practitioner is doing. Niguan, inner observation. Not analysis, not reflection in the ordinary sense, not the mind examining itself in search of answers to questions it has already formed. Something quieter than that, something closer to what the eye does when it rests on a still surface of water and simply receives what is there. The lamp is out. The night has come to its own depth, and the practitioner sits with the patience of someone who has learned, slowly and through long practice, that this depth is not empty. It is the fullest part of the day. The oldest Chinese philosophical traditions drew a circle around all of this, around the alternation of daylight and darkness, around the rising and the falling, around the going out and the coming home. They named the two great movements yin and yang, and what they meant by those names was not a simple duality, but something more like a description of how reality breathes. Yang rises, expands, illuminates, drives outward. Yin gathers, cools, deepens, draws in. Neither is the beginning, neither is the end. Each contains within itself the smallest possible seed of the other, and at the moment any one of them reaches its fullest expression, that seed has already begun to grow. The circle is never broken. The turning is never done. Night is yin at its most generous. Not darkness as the defeat of light, but darkness as the condition that makes the next light possible. The deepest part of the night is the place where what was spent during the long yang hours of the day begins, quietly and without announcement, to be restored. This restoration is not passive. It is the most essential work that a body and a mind do in any given cycle of hours. What the day scattered, the night gathers. What the day burned, the night slowly replenishes. What the day divided into 10,000 separate concerns and obligations and responses, the night begins, gently, without insisting, to return toward wholeness. The practitioner's breath slows, the room remains dark. In the Zhuangzi, there is a passage that has been returned to many times by those who sit in this kind of quiet. It describes a practice that the text calls Jua Wang. The word means sitting and forgetting. Not forgetting in the ordinary sense, not the forgetting of where keys were left, or of a name not quite retrieved. This forgetting is a different kind. It is the gradual voluntary release of everything the mind has constructed to make itself feel solid and located and distinct. The name releases, the role releases, the boundary between what is inside and what is outside becomes at the furthest extent of the practice, a boundary the attention can no longer locate. What remains when that loosening is complete is not nothing. The text is careful about this. What remains is an open, undivided awareness, the same awareness that was always there, beneath every layer of constructed distinction, quiet and present, and requiring no particular shape to continue. The ancient teachers described this as a homecoming rather than a loss. The self does not vanish. It returns to something. It returns to the ground from which it arose at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of a life, at the beginning of whatever moment the question of individuality first became a question. That ground has a name in the older cosmological framework. It is called Wuji, the limitless, the undifferentiated, the state that precedes all distinctions without therefore being nothing at all, more like a field before any particular form has emerged from it, present everywhere, unable to be pointed at directly, and yet the source from which every particular thing that can be pointed at has come. Sleep is the nightly nearness to that field, not the same as Zuowang, not a philosophical practice in the deliberate sense, but in the same direction, the body settling toward the ground it came from, the mind releasing the particular shapes it wore during the long-lit hours, the breath slowing toward the rhythm that requires no management, no supervision, no will. A winter landscape holds its breath between the deepest cold and the first returning warmth. The snow lies unbroken on the fields. The bare trees stand perfectly still against a sky that is not quite black. This is the yin at its most complete, not empty, not inert, but gathered to a point of such concentrated stillness that the whole landscape seems to be listening for something, holding something in reserve, waiting with the patience of something that has always known the waiting would be worth it. The yang has not disappeared. It is present in exactly the way that the eye in the Taijitu is present, the small bright point carried within the dark field, already preparing its return, already warming in the depths of what looks, from the outside, like only cold. The practitioner in the dark room understands this without needing to name it. The body knows it. The slowing breath knows it. Every system that the day required to be alert and outward-facing and responsive is now allowed to do the other thing, the inward thing, the consolidating thing, the thing that yin exists to accomplish, and that yang, for all its warmth and drive and illuminating force, cannot do on its own. The philosopher Zhou Dunyi, working in the Song dynasty with a brush and a circle of ink, described the supreme ultimate as generating yang through movement and yin through stillness, not as a sequence in which movement comes first and stillness follows, but as a perpetual alternation in which each gives rise to the other in an order without beginning. The movement generates, the stillness restores, the movement generates again. What the circle describes is not a line with a start and an end, but something that curves back on itself, self-completing, self-renewing, requiring nothing from outside itself to continue. The diagram he drew has been reproduced 10,000 times in the centuries since he set it down. It is still the same circle. It has not worn out. The nightly return to deep yin is the same movement at the scale of a single life. The day expended what the night replenished. The night replenishes what the day will expend again. The cycle does not favor one over the other. It requires both with equal necessity. And what the oldest Chinese philosophical traditions noticed, what physicians and philosophers and practitioners of Taoist inner cultivation all arrived at through different routes, is that the body knows this already. The body has always known this. The difficulty is not teaching the body how to restore itself. The difficulty, if it can be called that, is stepping aside sufficiently to allow what the body already knows to proceed. Jing is the word for stillness, as a cultivated philosophical state. not the stillness of a stopped thing, not the stillness of something waiting reluctantly for something else to finish, the stillness of water that has settled, the stillness of a mind that has not emptied itself, not suppressed its movement, but let the movement complete itself, the way a stone dropped in a pool generates its rings, and then, given sufficient time and no further disturbance, allows those rings to spread to the edges and fade, and the surface to become what it was before the stone arrived. One ging is the surface after the rings have faded. It is not an absence. It is a condition, a specific quality of presence that the tradition regarded as the ground of all genuine activity, the yin from which any yang worth its warmth must ultimately arise. A calligrapher once lifted her brush between characters and held the pause, not hesitation, not the search for the next stroke. The pause that belongs to the composition as much as any mark she would make, the yin breath between yang strokes, the space that gives the ink its meaning, the silence that lets the sound of what was written continue to sound in the mind of whoever reads it afterward. She held the pause, then she set the brush down and was finished for the evening. The white space on the paper was not empty. It was carrying something, the weight of what surrounded it, the possibility of what might yet arrive in another session on another day, the completion of a form that required both the marks and the unmarked field to be what it was. The room where the practitioner sits is like that. The darkness is like that. Not the absence of light, but the field in which the light, when it returns, will mean something. The Tao Te Ching says the usefulness of a vessel lies in its emptiness. The hollow of a wheel's hub is what makes the wheel function. The open space of a room is what makes the room habitable. This is not a paradox intended to provoke puzzlement, not a clever reversal designed to unsettle. It is a description of how things actually work, offered plainly and without drama, in the confidence that anyone who looks carefully at the things around them will see that this is true. The hollow and the full require each other. The yang expansion requires the yin receptivity into which it can pour itself. The active requires the still. The form requires the formless. This is not philosophy as an argument to be won, but philosophy as an observation that, once made clearly enough, changes how almost everything looks, not suddenly, but gradually and without reversing. The hour between midnight and first light has its own quality that does not resemble any other hour of the day. The household is still. The breathing in each room is slow and even. The house itself has become in some sense a single organism, all its separate lives cycling through the same deep yin together, the vital energy gathered inward, held close, the way water is cupped in both hands not to keep it from escaping, but to bring it somewhere it can be used. What is gathered in these hours is not taken from the night, it is given by it. The night offers its depth freely, without contract, to everything that is willing to enter it, without resistance. The practitioner in the dark room has been sitting long enough now that the boundary between sitting and drifting has become difficult to locate. This is not failure. This is the practice arriving at its purpose. The thoughts that came when the lamp went out, the residue of the day, the calculations and concerns, and small unfinished things have been released. One by one, the way a hand releases a stone into still water, watching the ripple spread, and then watching the surface settle again. Some thoughts came back. They were released again. This is not a battle. The tradition is clear on this point. The release is not an act of force, but an act of recognition. The recognition that the thought, like the stone, is separate from the water, and that the water's nature is to return to stillness whenever it is allowed to. Zhuangzi, in his later years, watched clouds move and dissolve across a gray sky. He watched the shapes form and then release their forms, and he understood that the releasing was not the end of the cloud, but a transformation of the same substance into another configuration. The way winter's stillness is not the end of the tree, but the tree's energy gathered into the roots, ready. He did not find this distressing. He found it, in the sustained company of such observations, to be the most honest account of how things actually move, not toward endings but through transformations, each form temporary, and each transformation continuous with what came before, and what would come after, in ways that no single moment of observation could fully trace. The body lying in the dark is part of this. The slow rise and fall of the chest is part of this. The warmth that pools in the heaviest parts of the body as sleep deepens, that gathering is part of this. The ancient Chinese medical tradition named the organs that participate in this restoration, mapped the channels through which the vital energy moves during the yin hours, described the relationship between the kidneys, the organ most closely associated with deepest winter, with the most consolidated yin, and the quality of restoration that becomes available only when the outward demands of the day have been fully released. What they were mapping was not a mechanism in the purely technical sense. They were tracing a pattern of correspondence, the same pattern that moves through the seasons, through the alternation of day and night, through the circle of the Taijitu, at the scale of a single body breathing in the dark. The snowfield holds its breath. The bare branches are still. The practitioner in the dark room has by now set aside the effort of sitting. Sitting is simply happening, the way breathing is simply happening, the way the darkness is simply present, without requiring anyone to maintain it. There is a philosophical claim in all of this that is not stated as an argument, but is carried instead by the whole weight of the tradition that produced it. The claim is this: rest is not the absence of activity. It is a different mode of the same life force, the mode through which what was spent is replenished, what was scattered is gathered, and what was differentiated across the long hours of the day is returned, gradually and without insistence, toward wholeness. This claim has consequences that the tradition took seriously. If rest is not the absence of activity, but its essential complement, then the hours given to deep yin are not hours wasted, not hours subtracted from the useful life, not hours to be minimized in order to maximize what can be accomplished in the remaining ones. They are the condition of the accomplishment. They are the hub. Without the empty center, the wheel does not turn. The I Ching encodes this understanding at the level of its most fundamental grammar. The hexagrams are composed of broken and unbroken lines, yin and yang in their simplest visible form. Every situation that can be described, every question that can be brought to the text, finds its answer in a configuration of these two kinds of line, which are not opposites in the sense of opposing forces struggling for dominance, but complementary modes of the same underlying movement, each requiring the other to mean anything at all. A hexagram composed entirely of unbroken lines is not a hexagram of pure power. It is a configuration that by the internal logic of the system is already on the verge of breaking, already carrying within its fullest yang expression the seed of the yin that will follow. The opposite is equally true. The most fully broken configuration carries within it the point from which the yang lines will begin to return. The circle cannot be stopped at either extreme. What appears to be a stopping point is always already a turning point. The practitioner in the dark room does not need to understand the hexagrams to be living inside this logic. The body already knows. The breath already knows. The way the day's activity gave way to this stillness, not all at once but gradually, in the slow settling that began sometime in the late hours and deepened as the night went on. This is the same movement that the broken and unbroken lines describe, at the scale of a single night, in the language of a single life. What the practitioner is practicing, what the long tradition of Naguan and Zuowang developed over centuries of patient inner work, is not a technique for achieving something that would otherwise be unavailable. It is an alignment with what is already happening. The restoration is occurring. The vital energy is moving in its yin channels. The gathered stillness is doing its work. The practice is simply the removal of resistance to what is already, without any assistance, in the process of being restored. This is what Wu Wei looks like from the inside. Not the absence of engagement, but the presence of engagement, so fully aligned with the movement of the Tao that the distinction between the practitioner and the movement can no longer be clearly located. The river bends around the stone without deliberation. It finds the path of least resistance, not through any calculation, but through pure responsiveness, the water's nature meeting the stone's nature, and the meeting producing, without decision, the shape of the river at that point. The stone is changed by the water over long time. The water's course is changed by the stone in each moment. Neither dominates. The river continues. Sleep is like that. The practitioner in the dark room is like that. The body's deep yin work is like that. The night is meeting the body's need for restoration, and the body is meeting the night's invitation to stillness, and the meeting is producing, without any plan being required from either side, something that serves both, something that serves the whole cycle of which both are part. By now, the practitioner has been in the dark for a long time. The posture has softened. The deliberate inward attention has dissolved into something that is simply present, the way the darkness is simply present, not held in place by effort, but resting in its own nature. The thoughts have become slower. The spaces between the thoughts have become longer. These spaces are not nothing. They are not gaps in experience. They are the yin of consciousness, the still ground from which the next thought will arise, when it arises, and into which each thought subsides when it is finished. The practitioner is no longer managing the spaces. The practitioner is resting in them. The Taoist inner tradition understood the deepest meditation states and the deepest sleep to be approaching the same territory from different directions. Zhuang, sitting in forgetting, moves toward the release of all constructed distinction. Deep sleep moves in the same direction, not through philosophical practice, but through the simple insistence of the body's own nature. The practitioner who sits in zazen at the edge of sleep is not confused about the difference between the two. The practitioner simply understands that the same direction is being traveled by both roads, and that arriving at the destination by either route is a legitimate expression of the body and mind's capacity to return, to release the constructed, maintained, effortful separateness of the day, and find again the ground from which that separateness will arise again, refreshed, in the morning. The ground has a name. It is Wuji, the limitless, the state before distinction. It does not go anywhere while the day is happening. It is always already there, beneath every division and differentiation, the way silence is always already present, beneath every sound, not destroyed by the sound, not requiring the sound to end in order to persist, but simply the field in which the sound occurs, and into which, when the sound ends, the air returns. A ceramic vessel sits half filled with water in a courtyard at dusk. The surface of the water is still. Above it, the pale sky of early evening is reflected with absolute fidelity, and in that reflection, The boundary between the water and the sky becomes difficult to name. The vessel holds both. The water holds the sky. The sky extends into the vessel. The stillness makes this possible. If the water were moving, the reflection would break. The stillness is not the absence of the water's nature, but its most complete expression, the condition in which the water can be fully what it is. The sleeping body in the dark room is like the water in the vessel. The stillness makes possible a depth of rest that no amount of activity, however purposeful, could produce. The depth is not manufactured, it is allowed. It arrives when the surface becomes still, and the surface becomes still when the demands of the day are, one by one, released. There is nothing required from the practitioner now. The work of releasing has already been done, or is being done, without the supervision of any particular effort. The breath is slow. The body is heavy in the good way, the way of something that has set down a weight it was carrying, and found, in the setting down, that the weight was not as necessary as it had seemed during the long hours of carrying it. The room is dark and cool. The night is at its deepest. Outside, if there were anyone awake to observe it, the winter landscape would be perfectly still. The branches would not be moving. The snow would be unbroken across every surface where it had fallen. The sky above would be very dark and very old, and the stars visible through the darkness would be the same stars that the Zhou dynasty scholars watched from their towers when they first mapped the hexagrams to the movements of the cosmos, the same stars that Zhou Daini watched when he put down his brush after drawing the Taijitu, and let the stillness of the late hour tell him what the diagram could only point toward. The stars are present. The night is present. The ground beneath the snow is gathering warmth, in the same way the sleeping body is gathering what it needs. The circle in the mind's eye, the one drawn on stone and silk and paper across more than 2,000 years of human thinking about how things are, turns slowly in the way that only something without destination can turn. The dark field curves into the light. The light curves back into the dark. At the fullness of the dark, the small bright point is present, already growing. At the fullness of the light, the small dark point is present, already deepening. The boundary between the two is not a line, but a curve, a movement, not a division. The circle that surrounds them both is unbroken. It has always been unbroken. It will continue to be unbroken through every transformation that occurs within it, because the breaking and the mending are themselves inside the circle, and the circle contains them without being altered by them. The breath moves out, the chest falls, the air goes, and then, without decision, without effort, without anyone managing the process, the chest rises again, the air returns. The yin releases into yang, and the yang releases into yin, and the body continues, breathing in the dark, the most natural expression of the most ancient pattern there is. The practitioner has stopped sitting and started simply being present in the dark room, which is the same thing the dark room is doing, simply being present, holding the stillness, allowing the night to be the night, without asking it to be anything else. The tradition that produced the practice of Neiguan also produced this understanding that there is no distance between a person who has genuinely settled into yin and the yin itself. The boundary that seemed to require maintenance, the distinction between the one who practices and the thing being practiced toward, becomes at sufficient depth, a distinction that the attention can no longer locate. What remains is not nothing. What remains is not even silence. Exactly, though silence is closer than almost anything else to naming it. What remains is the open field, the ground prior to the first distinction, the state from which all forms arise, and to which all forms in their season return, not as loss, not as ending, but as the completion of the movement that began when they first emerged from it, long before tonight, long before this particular life that is breathing slowly in this particular room, in this particular dark. The circle turns. There is no hurry in the turning. There never has been.